Greetings all, and welcome to this session on new materialism, post-structuralism, and process philosophy, or some complex spiral of those and many other foci. I want to introduce to you first Dr. Richard Livingston, who's the executive director of the Cobb Institute. He was the director of operations from 2019 to 21, got his PhD in 2015 from Claremont Graduate University, where he'd specialized in philosophy of religion and theology. He taught as an adjunct instructor in philosophy and religious studies at 4 colleges in Southern California from 2011 to 19, and has worked in IT since the early 1990s. It's intimidating. He holds a master's degree in theology from the University of Chicago and a bachelor's degree in Near Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Andrew, for the invitation. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an introduction to the primary question of my dissertation, and I hope eventually a book. Perhaps the number one reason that I chose to do my PhD in philosophy of religion and theology is that during the first couple of years of my graduate studies, it became increasingly clear that I had a problem with promiscuity. No, not that kind. Get your mind out of the gutter. It was just that I was really interested in many modes of thought. And I couldn't quite make up my mind. I still really can't make up my mind. I wasn't interested in religious studies or theology or philosophy alone. But I felt most comfortable wandering the boundary between those multifarious modes of thought. So unable to determine where my theological questions end and my philosophical questions begin, and vice versa, and unwilling to take a stand for or against either side, I gravitated toward the complex and contested interstitial space where I could be informed by and create conversations between both. So feeling at home, most at home in a place of homelessness, when I began thinking about possible dissertation topics, I was determined to find a way to consider the contours of their connections. And this presented a huge challenge because philosophy and theology by themselves, as you know, are notoriously elusive, massively diverse, and highly contestable. There are countless ways of engaging in philosophical and theological reflection, so there's no single right answer to the question, what is philosophy or what is theology? But for all of the ways in which they might be individually unique, the nature of their relation to one another presents an even greater set of difficulties. Are they opposed to each other, independent of one another, complementary, interdependent, etc.? Despite the enduring tensions and sometimes bitter conflicts between them, one of the defining features that philosophy and theology have shared in common is the endeavor to make sense of that which is viewed as ultimate in some significant or even primordial sense. On the philosophical side, you've got examples like Plato's demiurge or Aristotle's prime mover, Whitehead's divine poet. On the theological side, you've got examples like Hinduism's Brahman, Judaism's Yahweh, Christianity's God. Examples could be multiplied many times over, but what they all demonstrate is that some notion of an ultimate or transcendent or infinite, whether it's expressed in the form of an impersonal universal principle or a personal supreme being or transpersonal reality, has played a pivotal role within their respective settings. And coming to an understanding of its meaning and significance has been and continues to be of paramount importance for both, and for me. But things get messy in a hurry because the philosophical ultimate has often been connected to or identified with the theological ultimate. Are they the same? Different? What's their relation to one another? Put differently, the effort to elucidate an understanding of the divine reality has commonly been intimately intertwined with the endeavor to articulate a view of being itself. The result is that, as at least one philosopher puts it, the linkage of the problem in being and the question of God has been one of the more durable features of the legacies of philosophical and theological reflection in Western thought. Aristotle provides one of the earliest and most influential examples when he links what he calls first philosophy, or the science or logos of being, ontology, with the science or logos of God, theology. In his metaphysics, he tries to find a fundamental science that can rationally ground or logically explain everything that exists in the most universal terms. For him, the sensible objects or material entities require a reason for being both what they are and that they are in order for the cosmos to be rationally comprehensible. He eventually finds a foundational ontological principle in a theological proof. His demand that the universe be explicable eventually leads him to the conclusion that God is the purely actual substance, or the eternal entity that provides the explanatory ground of all entities, because it is the foundational principle of the movement of entities from potentiality to actuality. His prime mover thus constitutes the primary ground of beings and the explanatory principle of motion in all particular beings. Many other individuals like this could be mentioned, like Aquinas' idea of God as being itself, Spinoza's causa sui, Hegel's absolute spirit, Tillich's ground of being. The point here is that an enormous amount of Western thought has been dominated by the idea that there's a fundamental connection and sometimes absolute identity between God and being. So given the singular importance of these notions of ultimacy, I wanted to explore some of the possibilities for understanding the distinction and the connections between them in a contemporary setting. So to set the stage for my guiding question and bring it more sharply into focus, I draw on the work of 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger. His persistent and perceptive engagement with the question of being and the question of God has been considered crucial to this discussion by a number of prominent thinkers, including many theologians, in part because he identifies and articulates some pivotal problems in a very potent and profound way. His views are complex and compelling, even if not always clear and consistent. Among his research notes written shortly before his death in 1976, Heidegger summarized his entire life's work as an on the way in the field of paths for the changing questioning of the manifold question of being. Because the question is multifaceted and the subject is utterly unique, Heidegger never attempts to articulate a comprehensive thesis or develop a definitive definition of being. Instead, he approaches it from a variety of vantage points. One will thus search his writings in vain if one wants to locate a final formulation of the sentence, being is X. Indeed, as we'll see, any such locution would betray his consistent critique of precisely the kind of thinking that he wants to overcome. Put differently, he's never interested in discovering the essential nature of being in the way that, say, an astrophysicist might be interested in discovering the nature of galaxies, or a biologist might be interested in discovering the nature of living beings. Whatever might be said about being, it is not a being. So it isn't amenable to analysis in the way that empirically observable entities can be analyzed. So he thinks that the way in which being should be interrogated needs to radically differ from the kind of inquiry undertaken in order to explicate everyday entities. Nonetheless, Heidegger's most important public engagement with the question of being begins with the open lines of his most influential book, Being and Time. The epigraph to the opening chapter is a quote from Plato's Sophist. This is what the dialogue, the Platonic dialogue says. For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. Some 24 centuries later, are we in any better position to respond to this ontological puzzlement? Do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being, Heidegger asks? For the next 5 decades, his response is consistently, not at all. The difficulty immediately doubles, however, because not only do we lack an answer to the question of what we mean But what he thinks we also lack an awareness that we don't have an answer. Not only have we forgotten what we mean by being, but we've also forgotten that we don't know what we mean. And this sort of double forgetting is what Heidegger has in mind when he speaks of the oblivion of being. So while Dasein might be the one for whom being is an issue, the full significance of being has long been lost, covered over by layer upon layer of traditional ways of thinking about and being in the world. It is fitting, he therefore says, that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. Indeed, because he was convinced that the thought of being had remained in oblivion from at least Plato onward, destructuring or deconstructing traditional understandings on the one hand, and re-raising and reconsidering the ontological question in new ways on the other, constitute the pivotal axes around which his entire corpus swirls. So why did he think that we remain in a kind of oblivion to or estrangement from being itself? Heidegger's answer can be expressed in a single word: metaphysics. Now, it's important to note that for him, metaphysics isn't just limited to the kind of intellectual activity that some sort of nerdy philosophers do while sitting at their desks, but instead it involves a kind of pervasive paradigm, a general understanding or shared perspective held in common by an entire people, a way of thinking and being that shapes their most basic presuppositions about the world, and thus constitutes a kind of comprehensive horizon for understanding what it means for anything to be at all. So as he famously wrote in a lesser-known essay, metaphysics grounds an age, by which he meant that through a particular comprehension of truth, it provides that age with the ground of its essential shape. The ground comprehensively governs all decisions distinctive of the age. In all the various ways that human beings relate to one another and other beings, they are, according to Heidegger, in every respect, sustained and guided by metaphysics. Now, the primary reason he thinks that metaphysics has concealed or hidden the truth of being itself is that at its core, it only thinks beings as beings. So wherever the question is asked what beings are, beings as such are in sight. Questions like, what is it to be a being? Or what is the fundamental structure and nature of beings? Or what is the essential beingness of beings? That's the central concern of metaphysics. And because its interest is entities as entities, he thinks that it isn't able to turn itself to being as being. It conceals being, or as he puts it, metaphysics is the oblivion of being, and that means the history of the concealment and withdrawal of that which gives being. Even those thinkers who have explicitly attempted to give an account of beings, like Aristotle, Aquinas, Leibniz, and Hegel, they've been driven by a kind of impure motive to illuminate beings qua beings, or the being of beings, or the totality of beings. But the truth of being in itself, and as such, remains hidden. So in saying that metaphysics is a matter of the essence of entities and entities as a whole, Heidegger means that its primary objective is to represent them or give an account of them in a logically unified, ordered, and coherent way. As with Aristotle noted above, in order to do that, it must provide a logical reason for beings. It must give a causal account of beings. It must systematize beings. It must ground beings in an irrefutable and indestructible rational foundation because it seeks the ultimate origin, source, and reason for the existence of beings. His critique of the metaphysical fixation on foundations is, for me, most concisely and cogently captured in a critical analysis of Hegel in his 1957 lecture, The Ontotheological Constitution of Metaphysics. In it, Heidegger issues one of his many calls to overcome metaphysics. And I can't stress this enough. Overcoming for Heidegger does not mean to destroy or obliterate metaphysics. Instead, it's to deconstruct and transcend it. That is, to examine its historical origins, to consider its conceptual roots, and expose its essential elements in order to open up the possibility of pursuing novel approaches. According to his account of the history of philosophy, since its inception with the ancient Greeks, Western metaphysics has eminently been both ontology and theology. Inasmuch as metaphysics asks about the beings as such and as a whole, the wholeness of this whole is the unity of all beings that unifies the generative ground. To those who can read, he writes, this means metaphysics is ontotheology. Put differently, he argues that metaphysical thinking moves simultaneously in two directions that are distinguishable but not separable. So from its ontological side, metaphysics asks questions like, what are beings in general as beings? Or what is an entity as an entity? What is it for an entity to be? It is ontology because it gives a rational account, or logos, of the on, he, on, the Greek word on, in terms of beings qua beings. It thinks about entities in general, which means that it seeks to explicate the essential element that's common to all entities, or the most general ground of entities. It is, in other words, concerned with the ground-giving unity of what is universal, because what is most general in beings is universally applicable to all beings. Metaphysics is thus ontology when it investigates beings insofar as they are beings in general, or the being of beings. And it elucidates, or tries to elucidate, the absolute bedrock or ultimate foundation beyond which inquiry about entities can go no further. From its theological side, metaphysics asks questions like, which being is the highest, and in what way is it? What entity is the supreme, paradigmatic, or exemplary sense, and in what sense is it? What is the reason for beings? What is the primordial source of beings? It is theology because it strives to give a rational account, or logos, of the theon, or supreme being, who is the ultimate cause and highest existent ground of being. It thinks of the totality of beings, or beings as such and as a whole, and is chiefly concerned with the founding unity of all that accounts for the ground, which is the highest being. As theology, metaphysics thus seeks to render the totality of beings intelligible by bringing it into correlation with a supreme or divine being. Metaphysics is thus theology when it inquires into the ultimate meaning and source of the being of beings, and when it attempts to establish the primordial foundation from which all beings issue and by which they can be explained and justified in a divine being. For Heidegger, then, the essential constitution of metaphysics is based on the unity of beings as such, and this is his words, in the universal and that which is the highest. The universal and that which is the highest. Taken together, the universal and the highest, they're two sides of a single coin, two logoi that have been fused together, intimately intertwined in such a way that is neither the one nor the other alone, but simultaneously both at once. Hence, onto-theo-logi. Each side seeks to establish a rational foundation. Ontologically, it establishes the ground from the bottom up by generalizing the essence of entities as such. That is, ontology grounds by delimiting the bedrock beneath which the metaphysician's investigations cannot penetrate further. Theologically, it establishes the ground from the top down by formulating a conception of the supreme being that justifies the existence of beings. That is, theologically grounds by determining the source from which all entities ultimately issue and by which they can be subsequently justified. Therefore, says Heidegger, all metaphysics is at bottom, and from the ground up, what grounds? What gives account of the ground? What is called to account by the ground? And finally, what calls the ground to account? Now, part of his worry here is that in addition to concealing the meaning and truth of being, metaphysics also conceals the meaning and truth of God. The metaphysical God is understood in terms of things like logical necessity and fashioned into a principle that provides an ultimate explanation of things that is firmly secured in place by means of human reason. As Heidegger famously chides, before the causa sui, man can neither fall to his knees in awe, nor can he play music and dance before this God. Such an abstract and depersonalized deity is not worthy of devotion, reverence, and worship. On the one hand, then, metaphysics has prevented philosophy from thinking about being in terms other than beings, and on the other, it has misconstrued the nature of God, thereby obstructing our relationship with the divine. More deserves to be said, but with his critique of the ontotheological essential constitution of metaphysics, I think he offers an incisive and insightful, even if sometimes conflicting and controversial critique of the entire beings as being and the God as ground of being tradition. To be sure, there are deep disagreements in the scholarship about just exactly what ontotheology finally comes to, its penchant for sweeping generalizations and massive oversimplifications, the quality of its interpretation of historical figures, how one ought to respond if in fact it is valid. Even so, his critique provides a powerful lens through which to focus the question of the relation between being and God in a contemporary setting, and what that might mean for thinking and speaking of these notions in novel and enriching ways. Put differently, just as his deconstruction of ontotheology is intended, at least in part, to disentangle die Seinsfrage from die Gottesfrage, the question of being from the question of God, for the purpose of thinking about being in an originary way, the central question guiding my project is the following. After the critique of ontotheology, what is the relation between being and God? So to conclude, my primary thesis is that the relation involves a mutual dependency and an inseparable connection without collapsing into an absolute identity. Successfully showing this requires, as Heidegger himself suggests, drawing out some unexpected distinctions and connections. So what I try to do is put three radically different approaches into a critical conversation with one another to consider alternative ways of refiguring the relation. The first is Schubert Ogden, well-known process thinker, who wants to supersede ontotheology by means of a transcendental metaphysics. The second is Jean-Luc Marion, who wants to exceed ontotheology by means of a saturated phenomenology. And the third is Catherine Keller, who wants to unseat ontotheology by means of a post-structural chaosmology. My hope in my project is that by disrupting commonly accepted delimitations through a critical comparative exploration of the ontotheological connection, an eruption of illumination might unfold. Namely, that everything that is has an evental and relational quality, such that to be at all is to happen, take place, or occur within some event horizon. That being essentially occurs as event because beings essentially occur as events. That every being is a novel expression of creativity. That God is the universal instantiation or infinite expression of the creative advance into novelty. And finally, that the relation between being and God is most adequately understood in terms of an inseparable connection and reciprocal dependency rather than an absolute identity. Thank you.